We began our study of metaphysics with a discussion of Aristotle's original insight into the relation between being and unity, that being and unity imply one another. And from this we took the how of being and unity as determinative for the what. So, because being and unity imply one another, we were able to see that being and unity are implications. That their way of being and being one was determinative for what they are. From this, we then proceeded to take a clue from Heidegger, from Being in Time, that time was the horizon for any possible understanding of being. And we saw that anything that has time also would have aspect. And therefore, we supplemented the implication of time with that of aspect. We understood the determinations of time to be fundamentally those of presence and absence, and those of aspect to be those of completeness and incompleteness. And we attempted to illuminate the way in which these four implications are one. We said that there were three kinds of implication, taking a clue from Kant, from the categories. And we said those were necessary, possible, and problematic. Problematic being, for our work, the most important. So today, I think we need to go back to the issue of illumination and try to understand the way in which illumination relates to metaphysics and the possible illumination of implication. Because, of course, we saw that one of the problems is if we're implying something in a way that's problematic, not just necessary or possible, how can we illuminate that if the implication does not simply present itself or remain absent? It's this difficult or problematic status of implication of what is implied, the way in which being is implied in things, meaning is implied in words, etc., or deeds, that cause the problem for us, and therefore causes a problem for our attempts, or any attempt, to illuminate implication. So we went through a list of things that, if you will, were not acceptable ways of getting hold of implication, because there's no way that we could be certain of reaching our goal, nor necessarily able to fix the laws of implication so that they could work in our favor, nor minimize the risk that something was being implied in a way that was problematic, nor could we eliminate implication altogether. In other words, translate implication into meaning, sense, etc. Do away with implication in such a way that we explicate every single possible and necessary understanding of it. Nor, therefore, could we simply determine implication or determine the indeterminability of implication. In other words, translate implication into something determinable. Translate the uncertainty into certainty. I mean, in many ways, this is merely a cop-out anyhow, because it precisely does not deal with uncertainty, with indeterminability, qua uncertain, qua indeterminable. And precisely what we want to deal with, want to illuminate, if you will, is implication qua implied. Implication as implied. And so we may have to accept that we're not able to determine implication. If that's the case, then we may have, of course, some problems with ontology and with ontohenology, because it's difficult to find a first principle of ontology or ontohenochronophenomenology, metaphysics of any sorts, any kind of apodictic science, if precisely the laws that are supposed to govern this science fail to present themselves, and therefore about which we could not be certain. And the question then is not merely to overcome the ambiguity of implication or overcome or think it as unimplied. Rather, it seems to me, the problem is to take a clue, pick up on suggestions or hints before getting them, before grasping them, before understanding, before translating implication into explication. In other words, to, in some ways, remain with that which is implied. Not to translate into some kind of positive content, and therefore not to have any kind of positive science of implication, which is what linguistics and logic tend to do. And of course, if we say that unity, being, unity, time, and aspect, are implications, then their way of being one, and the way in which we attempt to illuminate them in metaphysics, may have to remain problematic as well. This doesn't mean that we should attempt to trace back from something like implication to some more founding or original concept of being, unity, time, or aspect. It's not that we want to go back to some necessary or possible concept of implication prior to the problematic understanding of implication. On the contrary, the difficulty is to stay with implication as implied. And unfortunately or not, if this is our task, if this is the task of metaphysics, then in the attempt to illuminate implication, we implicate ourselves. We implicate ourselves, and in some ways, we may also illuminate ourselves. In the attempt to illuminate things, therefore, whether these things are those of metaphysics, thoughts, objects, words, deeds, etc. In illuminating them, we illuminate ourselves. And as we said, the Greeks had a name for this. They had a name for us prior to anthropos, Prior to aner, prior to the philosophical names for us, they had a poetic name for us. They called us phos, light. And we suggested that this was because of the way in which we illuminate. We are the illuminating ones. Prior to being a rational animal, a featherless biped, however you want to define us, whatever essence you want to apply to us. And we took up this name, phos, to refer to ourselves as the ones taking up the task of illuminating implication, whether we succeed or fail, or not. In some ways, this is not the issue. The task then for phos would be to illuminate how we are and are one. But of course, not just ourselves, but that which we illuminate, things, others, the universe, as well as being in unity, time and aspect. So illumination might be how we, as phos, could be one. But this does not mean that phos could not illuminate itself because it would already be illuminated. In other words, this does not necessarily mean that we stand in the way of ourselves because we're already illuminated. Such, for example, a light or the sun or a fire or whatever it happens to be can't illuminate itself because it is illuminating others. Why not? Because this is to take phos as a thing like a light, like a lamp, like the sun. This metaphor is misleading. And the kind of illumination we're talking about is not that of a lamp. Exactly what kind it is, we'll have to see. Especially if what we're trying to illuminate is something like implication. We saw then that the history of philosophy has dealt with many of these problems in a particular way that has, in some sense, made it difficult for us to do metaphysics. Primarily, it seems to me, because it has translated these questions into answerable ones. It's translated these problems, and any problem, into that which, or for which, a solution can be found. And in that sense, not taken up the problematic, qua problematic, or translated implications into what can be made explicit, and therefore fail to understand implication as problematic. At the same time, it's privileged certain approaches to metaphysics by, for example, privileging ontology over henology, or the discussion of time over that of aspect. And so the task, if we continue, is to illuminate these implications for us, and not only for us. To see, if you will, if we can illuminate the way in which implications also illuminate one another. So the way in which being, for example, illuminates unity, time and aspect, or unity, being, time and aspect, etc., etc. And in addition to privileging ontology over henology, or overlooking the way in which everything that has time also has aspect. Philosophy seems to have moved away from the understanding of ourselves as phos, and therefore as illuminating in some sense, and moved away from implication as problematic. This has been, in some ways, founding for all of the natural and human sciences and the arts. The overlooking of implications, and the implications specifically of metaphysics. This procedure we've called translation, or retranslation. These translations and privilegings allow us to become, if you will, masters and possessors of nature, allows us to do science, to be scientists, to do the arts. The problem is, perhaps then, that these translations can be taken for the originals, whether they're original or not. And they seem to be elevated to the position of the origin. In this way, the scientific economy excludes implication, at least to the extent possible. This is a pragmatic course of action, obviously. We have to wonder, though, if one of the reasons why we're in crisis today, not only in the economy, but, if you will, on the planet, could be because these crises are in fact no crises at all, but rather a continual crisis that conceals the lack of crisis and therefore keeps this pragmatic course of action of the scientific economy in business. What happens then to the particular sciences? Physics, for example, becomes the search to prove the existence of smaller and smaller particles. Biology, the human sciences, classics, psychology, sociology, all of the sciences take up implication as that which can be made present or remain absent. This translation of implication into the language of presence and absence not only has these advantages, but costs as well. So much for the discussion of the sciences and, if you will, the sciences and the arts, and the implications that this approach to implication has wrought upon the planet and ourselves. The question then becomes, how can we think about ourselves as phos, as light, as illuminating, if illumination is our way of being one? How we then are implicated in what we illuminate would be implied by how we imply. Implying is then how we are one. The unity of our being and the being of our unity would be implication. So that we are not only implicated in our attempt to illuminate ourselves, but that is precisely what is the unity of phos. To be means to be implied, so that we, insofar as we are, would be implied, implying, if you will. Like being, which we determine on the basis of the how, we too would have to be illuminated on the basis of our how. How are we then one? We're one as illuminating. We're one as the way in which we are illuminating what we illuminate, how we illuminate. But this way of illuminating implications would be a problem. And therefore, our way of being one with things, with others, with words and deeds, would itself also be problematic. If we are to take up the task of illuminating something like us, or even illumination, however, we would also, it seems, have to take up that in which we do the illuminating. We're going to call this the universe, because that is the unity within which, through which, we illuminate, and in which we are therefore implicated. Our illuminations, however, are not like those of lights or the sun, as we said, not merely because we're implicated in our illuminations, but because we are one with it. One with the universe, one with what we illuminate, and implied by it. The experience of this, if you will, it seems to me, is the experience of the problem, the experience of the problematic. The experience is not merely being implicated in what one illuminates, but having a problem illuminating that which does not even present itself to us for illumination. What kind of illumination is that then? Or ourselves. If we don't present ourselves to ourselves as objects of illumination, do we illuminate anything then at all? Or do we far more have the experience, if you will, of not being able to illuminate? Being able to determine the unilluminability of ourselves or our objects, the universe, thoughts, things, words, deeds, implications, whatever. No. Why? Because, as I said, that would be to reduce the problem, once again, to a possibility or a necessity, far more. So, what is then this name we've given to ourselves of Phos? Or that we've taken up once again? So that we can take up the task of attempting to illuminate its implications. Because, as we said, Phos implies illumination, even if we're implicated thereby, to which there is obviously a value and a cost. associated with even the attempt to overcome the implications of illumination, translate it into lamps or fires, vision or envisioning, whether that of imagination or thinking, the light of the soul, of the world, of God, etc. And there's an entire tradition of metaphysics that takes this up. Such questions physics would claim to resolve, to be able to examine, to determine certainty with respect to at least portions of its investigation of light. This is not what we're talking about, obviously. But translating, for example, all of knowing or understanding into a physics of light. Thereby implicating itself as well in our tradition. And insofar as metaphysics takes up, if you will, the presuppositions of physics, its translations and transpositions, categories and concepts, it seems would also be implicated in this understanding of ourselves as phos. Because, of course, we're attempting to illuminate ourselves. Our task is illumination, but we have also said that we are this illumination. And when we say we are this illumination, we have to say that that is our unity, too, because unity is implied by being. And that we are this illumination as one, temporally and aspectually. The question then becomes, can we clue into this implication, but not only into this implication, but also into phos, into ourselves as this illumination? In other words, what is the relation between illumination and implication for us? In this way, it seems like we're going to have to take up a, if you will, study of ourselves with respect to our being and unity, time, and aspect. There would not be one of an empirical science, would not be one, therefore, of something like philosophical anthropology, psychology, sociology. But an investigation of how the metaphysics of implication might have something to say to us with respect to ourselves. In some sense, this is a detour we're going to make to ourselves, to the being, unity, time, and aspect of ourselves, in order to think, or illuminate, if you will, being and unity, time, and aspect. So that if we are one, time and aspect would seem to also be how so. And we recognize that time and aspect have traditionally been thought as dimension or perspective. But as we said before, this is not what we mean. Rather, time and aspect are how we are one, and therefore implicated in the temporality and aspectuality of things that we illuminate, so that we could even be one. The question then becomes, how do we illuminate ourselves if what we are to ourselves is not simply what presents itself to itself or is present to itself, but rather is only implied. You see the problem. How can I take up the ancient dictum to know myself? If I don't present myself to myself? Nor am I absent from myself, but only implied, and implicated in that attempt to illuminate myself. This is a problem. This is our problem. This is the problem that the history of philosophy as metaphysics has, for the most part, translated into a problem it can solve. Of course, it's very happy with this. This is the ground, of course, upon which the arts and sciences have built their entire history. And to a great extent, philosophy as well. How are we then going to illuminate the way in which time and aspect, not only being in unity, are implicated in us? If we say that Phos is the way in which we are one, that illumination is the unity of Phos. Or if you will, one way in which we are one. That being is implied in us, as is unity, so that we are implying, because as soon as we say we are, if I say I am Phos, or whatever else I am a featherless biped, being is implied. I am implying being, I am implying unity. What about time and aspect? How are they implied in this illumination, in this illuminating of Phos, in the way in which we are implicated then in the world? And so the way in which time and aspect are implicated also in our history, in the way in which the history of philosophy has been conducted, the way in which we conduct our own histories, etc., etc. And not only in our history, not only in the history of our particular lives, but in our very survival. That is, even in that of the universe. So it seems that this history could be implicated in our work because of temporality and aspectuality, because of time and aspect. Just as implicated in our survival and that of the universe. Not only us, therefore, others, plants, animals, the world, etc., etc. The question then becomes that of the survivability of survival and the historicity of history, how those, if they are implied by aspect and time, how they are implicated in the universe, in ourselves, in our illuminations. So, if time and aspect are the ways in which we are one. What we're going to try to illuminate is the way in which time comes to presence or absence as history, and aspect is complete or incomplete as survival. In other words, history and survival will be the terms we'll use for the way in which time and aspect are implied in us, in the universe, in things, thoughts, words, deeds, etc. Because as we know, the unity of our being is implicated in our very survival, as is metaphysics. In the survival, our very survival and the survival of the planet, right? Our families, our friends, everything you care about, whatever, the earth, the universe. Survival is the way in which our continuous aspect is one, while history seems to be the way in which our time presents itself. Which is not to say that there's no discontinuity in survival or absence in history. On the contrary, it's precisely completeness, incompleteness, continuity, discontinuity, which are the ways in which survival is one, in which we survive. The species, ourselves, families, friends, whatever it happens to be. And the way in which history, presences and absences, comes to presence and goes out into absence. But, perhaps unsurprisingly, history, like survival, is just as aspectual as it is temporal. Surviving is our way of continuing to be one. But it might not just be because we survived some past event that it is finished, complete, etc. On the contrary, maybe because we only survive, that we're still doing it, that it's not over, but remains unfinished, even unfinishable, incomplete, maybe even incompletable. Surviving, then, is not to be understood in the sense of, oh, something happened to me and I survived it, right? I will survive, as they like to sing. No, we're not talking about that. Survival, as we're understanding it, is our way of continuing to be one. Whether we survive it or not. And history, thought in terms of time, is not something that happened in the past, but rather as the way in which we are one completely or incompletely. So that past, present, and future are merely translations of the way in which we are one insofar as we present ourselves or absent ourselves. And survival and history are implied in metaphysics, implicated, if you will, in metaphysics as well. So it's not simply that insofar as we do metaphysics, we illuminate survival in history. But survival in history, the surviving of each of us, is implicated in what is done as metaphysics. The history of each of us is implicated in what is done as metaphysics. When we do metaphysics, we are one temporally and aspectually. So not merely us here, and not merely those who do metaphysics, but anyone whatsoever. Anyone that is phos, of course, whatsoever, insofar as their way of being is implying, is illuminating. Obviously, not merely limiting ourselves in our discussion even to us, to human beings necessarily. Survival then, and it must seem strange to somebody who would walk in off the street, for example, survival for us is not dependent on food and water, clothing and shelter, health and wealth, etc. It's not any of these kinds of things that we generally think of as surviving or survival. Nor, by the way, is surviving merely reducible to time or to history. Just as time is not reducible to aspect, so too survival is not reducible to history. Nor is it merely a question of surviving for the time being, or the event of coming into being and going out of it. Nor is it a question, therefore, of translating survival into the language of the arts and sciences, those who are occupied with the history of the world or the business of living, it's not a question of the survival of the species or of the fittest, whether on the level of sociology or biology, genes, etc., etc. No. Nor is it a question of the survival simply of the planet. Survival as we're using it, as we're understanding it, is a question of aspect. And so the way in which we are one in the universe. Illuminating. Illuminating implications, or taking up the task of illuminating implications as implied. And therefore, metaphysics, the attempt to illuminate being and unity, time and aspect, these implications, is crucial for our very survival. For the way in which we survive, continue, in other words. It's probably not surprising then that the way in which metaphysics has thought something like the implication of being has been for our very survival, which may at least begin to help us understand why being was translated into something like nature, a thing, predicate, cause, concept, element, idea, substratum, God, subject, etc., in the history of philosophy as metaphysics. This translation was for our very survival. And perhaps this is why it continues today. Similarly with unity. The translation of unity into identity, wholeness, totality, indivisibility, separability, for our very survival. So too with time and aspect, and survival itself. Was it necessary? Is it necessary to continue this way of illuminating implications? Or might we take them up as problematic, and therefore take up survival as a problem?